Hello. Today we're going over a historic event 50 years ago and the two movies that deal with it. Welcome to the HolmFront. Hello. Welcome. I am Tyler, your host, and as always, to my right is my overly artistic friend Mitch. Mitch, welcome.
Hi.
We have been going through subsequently a lot of movies lately.
Yeah.
And more so the movies to deal with the 2024 nominations for the Oscars, which I think this one has won, right? It's best screenplay or something.
Yeah. Best. Oh, I don't know if it's original or adapted. I think it's.
Oh, okay.
Because it's based on a historical event, but I don't know if it's based off of like a report or something specific, or if they just made. I think it's adapted. It's got to be adapted.
We'll have to look at that. We should have looked at it before.
Yeah,
Oh,
we
well.
should have.
Sorry.
Oh, whatever.
Yeah. So, but the one of the okay. So before we start here, anything going on with your channels that you'd like to?
No,
plug?
let's just jump
Okay.
in. Yeah, because we are. I do want to say because we are covering a good number
movies.
of the Oscar Best Picture nominees, and this one's not up for Best Picture or anything like that. We're not covering all of the nominees, but this is a movie that we were both kind of interested to see, and it's called September 5th, and it's about the terrorist attacks the terrorist attack in the 1972 Olympics in Munich. And then after we saw it, we thought, there was already another movie based on the same subject matter by Steven Spielberg called Munich. And so we watched that afterwards. And so we're going to do a comparison episode talking about both. So it's a little bit talking about its Oscar nomination. That's how it got into like the limelight of my attention of like, oh, what's this movie nominated? But I don't think really that's going to be the big discussion. I think right now we're just kind of unpacking the two because it is interesting how they tackle different sides of the same subject matter.
I forgot to ask, did that have any nominations or awards to that one?
It did. Yeah, that was
2005, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
2005, I think. And that was up for Best Picture, Best Director for Spielberg,
Wow.
and a whole bunch of other stuff. Best Music for John Williams.
It's kind of a shoe-in.
Yeah. No cinematography, though.
That's
which
crazy.
For shame.
That's
for
crazy.
absolute shame. Oh, my gosh.
That was a beautiful movie.
Yeah.
If nothing else, watch Munich just for the cinematography. I mean, it's a great movie already, but man, that cinematographer is a genius. It looked incredible.
He's a regular of Spielberg's.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, I was looking him up. And I wonder what the competition was like, because I know that year, probably going to be talking about that year more in the future, because this is the year that Crash won against Brokeback Mountain.
Oh, boy. Okay.
And Munich was in that scrap.
Just kind of get pushed to the side just because of that?
Yeah, it was just less... I don't know. Well, some people have some mixed feelings about Munich, which we'll talk about later, but I think it's no secret that we both really enjoyed it. But yeah, in terms of the cinematography, because I looked at that one, and I know Brokeback was there, which should have been there because it's a lot of outdoor, like nature sequences, so that's a lot harder to control when you can't manage the light as easily.
Right.
So I get that one, but some of the others I just wasn't really as familiar with, so I'd have to watch them.
Okay.
So I'll just trust that it was a competitive year.
Sure. We'll go with that.
And it wasn't a massive snub.
Well, yeah, originally, I don't think I'd heard anything about this movie. I think you've been trying to pay attention more often because Tuesdays are matinee for a theater near us, and so
Yeah.
we were just trying to keep our ears to the ground, essentially, of like what's out and when we can just go see it. And I think you were looking through the list and you read a synopsis of September 5th, and I said, I didn't know anything about that. It sounds really interesting, though. So you grabbed us some tickets last Tuesday and watched it, and it is a solid movie.
Yeah. It was a
just
great
upfront,
movie.
solid movie. But then you had mentioned also that Spielberg had something. We had assumed it was the same subject matter in a more cinematic fashion. We turned out to be a little bit wrong. Still a great movie. But we'll go into like the differences there in a minute. So September 5th. Let's start there.
Yeah. Actually, one other thing I will say about the Oscar thing, this movie is snubbed pretty hard by the Oscars this year.
Yeah.
This movie should have been, if it was like 10 or 20 years ago, I would assume September 5th would be up for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Editing.
Editing for sure. Yeah, it was
Yeah,
pretty stellar.
absolutely for those three, in addition to the screenplay nom. Potentially like one other acting nomination. Because I mean, you have like, what's her name? Isabella something or other from Conclave, who was great, but like she's in it for like 5 minutes.
Yep.
There's a woman in this movie. She's in it for way more, and I thought was just as convincing of a performance. So if you want to like, penny pinch and be like, oh, like, well, it's like, shut up. Like, if screen time matters, then it should have just gone to this woman. I think she did fantastic.
She did a great job. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, on a couple different levels. Anyway, so let's jump into September 5th.
Okay.
As we said, it's about the date, obviously. In 1972, there was a terroristic attack in Munich.
Did you say terroristic?
Yeah.
Is that how it's phrased?
I mean, it can be, yeah, terroristic.
I thought it was just a terrorist
attack. Sure, whatever.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Terroristic
they both
sounds like
they're both phonetically fine. So terrorist
Okay.
attack in Munich on the Olympic Games, surrounded by obviously a bunch of external factors. So here's the thing: it's very dicey to get into, because there are also things politically relevant today. It deals a lot with Palestine, with Israel, and then it deals with stuff that were relevant back then because they were in Germany. This is only 30 years after the end of World War II, and a lot of hostilities. So these games apparently were trying to bring a lot of cohesion to a lot of nations in general because it was a world war. So like trying to bring the world back together through the games, which I think is a great idea, but obviously the movie tackles that issue from a very apolitical stance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that one for me is one of the biggest compliments I could give it because it refrains from any opinions, and it does so in a very meta sense because it's about the reporters at the time. So it's almost reporting on the reporters in that moment and refraining from giving any kind of opinion, and it does so expertly.
Yeah.
So that was one of my favorite aspects of the film, while also trying to like summarize the film itself. Because it, like I said, it's within the ABC sportscast room. It's not even the news station, but they're covering the Olympics. But because they're there when it happens, they take over and try and cover this event that's happening in real time 2 blocks away. So that's September 5th.
Yeah.
Like I said, expertly done.
And part of the challenge there is they're not equipped to handle that kind of a story, like on a not necessarily even a technical level, but just like on a moral level.
Right.
And you get to see conversations between them where they're like, wait a minute, should we even be doing this? Or like, what's the ethical approach here? And everything's happening so fast, and they have to just make all these judgment calls. And the film does an excellent job, as you described it, just showing us what those conversations like either were like or could have been like, and then we get to decide for ourselves, if we agree or disagree with the characters' decisions. It was a really refreshing portrayal of journalists. I think I've been on. It made me realize just how, like, I guess, unsatisfied. I'll put it that way. I've been with a lot of journalism, like journalistic integrity. Like, you have to have integrity. You need to just be telling me things. Like, if you have an opinion, it needs to be very clearly squared separately from what else you're talking about. I need to be able to discern the difference between the two. And in a lot of cases, especially these days, it feels like journalism can be very, very sloppy. This
Or opinionated.
Or opinionated.
If you're an opinion journalist, that's one thing. But this movie really made sure to give you just what happened and not have a stance. And I think that's where they share
that meta
similarities, is that Munich did the same thing.
Oh,
it was also very like, whether or not Spielberg had an opinion on the matter, which he probably did, it doesn't bleed through the film. It was more like, this is what happened, and these are the kind of the themes that, or not themes, I guess that's a weak word, but kind of the things that those guys were going through morally. But
he pulled out like the moral consequences of everybody's actions. He's like, you guys are holding this stance. That's fine. Here's what you get when you do that.
Right. Yeah, just dealing with the consequences or the potential consequences of some of these actions. Same thing with September 5th. So jumping into September 5th a little bit, uh, like you were saying, that they were not equipped for this. What happened was that there was a group of what they apparently labeled terrorists in this moment came through and not abducted. They basically held hostage these Israeli competitors, and
Yeah.
then I don't remember. Were they making a list of demands?
Yeah, they had a
Yeah,
list of
they had a
demands.
list of, that's right. They had a list of demands, but they were trying to send a message to the world. So
Mm-hmm.
ABC, this group in Munich, were like, this is happening right across the street. We should be covering this.
Mm-hmm.
But the conversations that subsequently happen are, well, this isn't what we're supposed to be covering, for one. For two, like, should we be focused on this thing when the Olympic Games were still happening, apparently? They're like, well, show must go on. Like, there's
Yeah,
two people dead in there, but whatever. You know what?
yeah, it
We
was like
got to see our swim events.
yeah, it was surreal because they
Yep.
show like how people are just, and they're reporting how everyone's just kind of nonchalantly going about their day. It's like, wait a minute, you have people held at gunpoint in these, some of which have been shot.
Yep.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
are
and
we gonna?
that's how they started, was they heard the gunshots across the
Yeah,
street. So they knew there's something serious is going on. But they, in their minds, they're like, well, what do we do about that? Like, we got to leave it up to the police, and then we just continue. And so it brought up these real interesting conversations like, should you do more? Should you not? Should you pretend like it's not happening and try and keep everyone distracted while, people that have that job do their jobs? Difficult questions, but it
yeah,
asks them, and it kind of leads you to make the determination. So they kind of go with this like hybrid. They are covering the games, but also covering this event, and it's the what is he considered? I guess the director in the control
yeah,
room.
I
He's the one
suppose.
in charge of like what's getting broadcast. He's taking on the duty of monitoring and controlling what is getting picked up. Fantastic job, by the way. If that's actually what that man accomplished, like, guy deserves a raise.
Yeah,
Um, but he gets a camera from the studio out there to see the apartments. He sends some teams out in order to continue rolling and getting footage. So he was responsible for a lot of the footage that's out there of the terrorists. But one of the conversations that happens from that is, they got a camera pointing at this balcony that the terrorists keep showing up on. And so the conversation is, what if this guy pulls out one of their hostages and blows his brains out on live television?
right.
Is that something we should be showing? And it's like, well, is it something you shouldn't show? Because at that point, you have to deal with the consequences of, these people are trying to get out a message. And is this a message that we should broadcast to the world? Or is it something that we should, be censoring, essentially? It's
Yeah,
a very difficult question to answer, but it's something that goes back and forth. And it, like I said, the movie does not take a stance. It just presents these questions to you.
yeah, it's like people have a right to know what's happening in this situation, but at the same time,
Don't
it's
want to
almost like
encourage
you're
evil.
yeah,
Yeah.
you're encouraging the beast by giving them what they want, which is attention.
Yep.
So, yeah, I thought that was a really interesting conundrum, and I don't know that the characters or really the film, in addition to not taking a hardened stance, I don't know that it necessarily explores everything, but its hands-off approach let us get there and just kind of think about it for a little while and
Yep.
kind of contemplate it for ourselves, which I think is it was the goal and I think it was achieved.
Yeah. The whole movie is about you sitting in those questions,
Hmm.
because it never really reaches a conclusion, but
But
they
it
do the best with what they have
and
based
it
on those questions.
and it kind of made us feel like we were the reporters on some level
Yeah.
because we had to then ask because that's what they were dealing with and they couldn't answer, so they kind of try to find that walk this middle ground of being like, all right, well, let's show this, but then let's be careful of that, and try to mix and match. And they ultimately just kind of go through with it. But like the higher ups at ABC are just like, we're all right. Well, that's enough of that. Like, we're going to show something else now. And they're like, this is still unraveling. Like, what do you mean you're going to cut us off and show
Yeah, they
some
were dealing with time
random?
slots. CBS apparently
Yeah.
had a time slot, and they're like, nope, got to give it to CBS. It's like, they're dealing. What are they covering it? Because no, like, leave it with ABC. What are you doing?
Yeah.
But they're dealing with this corporatized entity that doesn't care. It's just like, look, man, they got the slot, and it's like, yeah, but they didn't know that a terroristic event is going to be going on right across the
Right.
street. So they can't bend at all. Anyway, it was interesting to see that too,
Yeah.
on how that was like everyone was getting their fingers involved. And so it was muddling the message, causing confusion. And so that was another I don't know, I guess question that was presented is, at what point does trying to answer the question just get in the way? Because now
Mm.
you have so many people that are putting in their input, and it eventually leads to this event that we'll talk about later. That like you're questioning. Well, I think you phrased it best with your question: who owns the story?
Yeah,
And that was
yeah.
kind of the central theme of the September 5th film, at least.
Yeah, specifically when that scene happens, it was almost like one of the characters was presenting, hold on, these are like people with families.
Yep.
Like this is their story and we're like, it was weird. It was interesting to see how the reporters were kind of like, hold on, we need to check ourselves. Are we just like interfering on something that's like, I don't want to say like none of our business, but like it's because they have obviously like they profit, they benefit from
Hmm.
reporting a story, especially one as sensational as this. So they kind of, I think, just to show that they would stop and pause and be like, hold on a second, let's just make sure we're not doing this for personal gain because we don't want to be exploiting these people, this horrific
Right.
crime.
But at the
Um,
same time, this is probably where the families are getting their information as well.
right.
So should you stop broadcasting at that point?
Exactly.
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
It's a
Well,
difficult one.
and it gets layered too because in the film, this is like I guess maybe a slight spoiler, but there's an interesting sequence where they're covering the story, and then the German police try to go in and stop the situation and confront the terrorists. But as the reporters are watching it, and they give you just enough time so you can get to the same conclusion as the reporters, you're looking at them going, what are they doing? They don't look like they're competent at all. Like they're
Right.
gonna get this is gonna go really bad. And what happens is the police force, like another group of them, they come storming into the building. And they're like, turn off all your cameras, because as it so happens, there's TVs everywhere. So the
Including in the
terrorists,
apartment buildings where the terrorists are hanging out.
right? So the terrorists can see the cops moving in on them and spoiling the whole thing. So it was interesting how the reporters kind of figured out like right before the police get there. They're like, wait a minute, are they able to see this too? Are they watching this? And that was another point where by just having it in the story, it sort of showed how when you're going to report on something, the truth of the matter, that truth gets revealed to everyone.
Yeah.
And certain people probably
com-
shouldn't have access to this right now because they're doing something tremendously wrong.
Sure.
And so, in order for us to solve this situation, we actually there needs to be the importance for certain secrets to be kept in place. So I thought that was kind of fascinating too, how it sort of depicted that whole sequence.
Well, it is an interesting depiction of what one can do with the truth, right? You
Mm.
can use it for good or you can use it for evil. And so it was a good way of kind of honing in on that thesis to kind of strengthen the film. But it also it cast light on a broader topic of the movie, which was, like we were saying, the race relations and the kind of conflict that were underlying all of this
Mm.
were also exacerbated because ABC is an American company. So this was an American broadcast station that apparently did not typically broadcast to Germany, even though that was where they were, located. But for the games, they were broadcasting to everybody.
Mm.
So everybody got to be able to view this, and because of that, also the police were hampered because they were not equipped to deal with this situation, for one. But they apparently were wrapped up in bureaucratic tape because the army and other branches of military weren't allowed to do anything about it either. So they were handing over the weapons to the police, saying, "Hey, here's a couple of sniper rifles. We'll show you how to use it real quick, and then you got to go do this on your own." So everyone's wrapped up in all this red tape and this stupidity and not being able to handle the situation. So now the ineptitude is being broadcast live, like he said, into the
Mm.
apartments where these
Mm-hmm.
terrorists are watching. So now they're just aware that like these guys don't know what they're doing. We can just watch whatever they're doing outside because they got a camera pointed at the building. So we can just do it and ask for whatever we want. And so it was very interesting to see how kind of the world was focused in on this. And at the end, it shows it was like 900 million people or something were watching this broadcast
Yeah.
in 1972.
That's
That's
wild.
a crazy amount of people for 1972 watching this. I think they said it surpassed the landing of the moon, right? Was it or somewhere around the same numbers?
Yeah, which makes sense because
And
more
that was
people had
69.
access to TVs. Well,
Right.
yeah, I guess it's only 3 years later.
Yep.
Yeah, that's fair.
So,
hmm
yeah, it was a lot of interesting questions, but I think the way that the movie handles it was expertly. Like,
Yeah, another actually point on the kind of race relations. So they have in the NBC crew a woman there who is German, and she's
ABC.
specific, or an ABC, yeah,
Yeah.
and she's specifically there because she's their translator. And I mean, okay, they're gonna need a translator. That makes sense for where they're shooting. But when the movie begins, before the events come down, there's a few comments that some of the people who work there that are just they're not very nice, and they kind of they
well,
kind
she's
of
a generation removed from World War II, so like,
yeah.
she's very likely related to people who were doing things that they should not have been doing.
Yeah, well, they almost seem to hold like Germany under like they were still like there was this like very like noticeable like anti-German sentiment and by everybody there. But as the film goes on, they kind of realize how integral she is because she's their translator, and it's incredibly valuable having someone be able to interpret what everyone's saying about the current situation. And not only that, she kind of speaks up for herself at some point and essentially says something along the lines of she's like, hey, just because I'm German does not mean that I align at all with what my country does, with what other people in my country have done, or my the politics of my country. I thought it was really nice how they just like basically separated that, and the film was just sort of like, hey, she's just a person, and then just moved on with the rest of the story and didn't do anything more because it didn't need anything more.
Right.
And everybody just kind of adapts. And it was almost like this broader message of when, when the situation is really dire, everybody who has integrity is going to
They're going to flock together.
yeah, they're going to flock together. They're going to bring their A game, and then all of our petty disagreements or our unfounded, prejudices, they just kind of evaporate because they really don't have a lot of water, anyways.
Well, you get a common a goal.
Yeah.
And if that common goal is to fight evil is a little bit reductive, but, to come against something, I guess, and when that is pretty clearly something wrong, and they're fighting for essentially the good, then like you said, you're going to remove the more basic, I don't know, prejudices, if you will.
Yeah, the surface level stuff.
Yeah, because I mean, and that's embodied in a conversation that happens pretty early. Is that she is? I forget what she's translating, but she's in there translating while someone else comes in to edit some film, and he's one of the top dogs there. So there's 3 levels. There's like the main director, and then there's the guy who's like he's the one that's in the control room, kind of dictating everything, and he's the one that hands over his position to the young kid, who eventually takes over the film. But the secondary guy, he's in there with her, and he says, he finds out that she's German, and then it leads this conversation where like, oh, so your parents were probably there, and she said, yeah, and he's like, oh, so they just didn't know either, huh? And so it's kind of this like backhanded compliment without him knowing anything about her or having ever met her. He was just throwing assumptions on her family essentially, and then therefore like letting it bleed down to her and how his perception of her was affected. And that's when she comes back and says, yeah, well, I mean, I'm not my parents, I think was her line. And I was like, that's a very interesting way to deal with it, because she didn't get super defensive or try and justify herself. She was just saying, hey, this is 30 years behind us, for one. For two, like, I didn't have anything to do with this. I just have a job here as a translator. Why are you holding this against me without even having met me or talked to me? And then that pervades through the film, because there's a Frenchman that has his prejudices against them. And then obviously you have the Israeli-Palestine conflict that's being reviewed to some extent within the movie. But it really harps on those things without necessarily, like we were saying, takes a side. It just kind of says like, hey, be careful what you just assume about people before you fully understand what you're talking about, or attributing something broadly to a single person. And that was embodied in that conversation. And then, like I said, throughout the movie, she proves herself to be not only an invaluable asset, but a person of high integrity and character, and someone who's very driven. Like she's in the room with a police scanner at some point without having been told to do so. She just gets the thing, puts it together, and then she's the one like listening to the reports of the police as they're going, and then reporting that information to the director in order for them to kind of get all the facts together. And she becomes an integral portion of this news reporting story and getting the information out to the public.
Yeah.
Which I thought was fascinating. Anyway, so yeah, it tackles a lot of those issues. It doesn't take a stance. It doesn't force feed a message down your throat. It really just sits there and lets you be a part of the unfolding story. And it gives you, two views, I think. It gives you part, you feel like a reporter because you're kind of figuring this data out and interpreting it as you do. But you also feel like you're part of the audience because you get to see some actual feeds from that time, like the real footage of that.
Yeah.
And you get to see a lot of what people were experiencing at the time and the confusion therein. And just kind of how the world was invested at that moment. And you can see why the opportunity was taken by these guys because the whole world was able to watch. Like they were able to get this message across, whatever that message may have been. And they did.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny. The guy who's or the anchorman, I think there's like maybe a couple shots
His name
where
is Jim.
Jim, yeah. But Jim almost exclusively exists as the real person.
Right.
Like there's very few shots where it's behind the camera actually looking at him. And I almost just didn't notice. I just assumed that they were making the footage look, because I obviously wasn't alive at that time, so I never watched the original footage or that newscast when it happened. Well, that was refreshing. I got to make myself sound young. Anyways.
Yay.
Because normally when you do that phrase, it makes you sound old.
It does.
So, okay. Anyways, but the fact that they were interlacing so much of the old footage from that report that they had captured, and it just blended seamlessly in, I just kind of assumed it was an actor for part of it, and then as the movie went on, I was like, actually, wait a minute, this is just original footage, isn't it? And they did such a great job just seamlessly. But so like there's moments where he's like, oh, wait a minute, I'm getting a report from, the newscast that we're actually going to have to cut to a break now. And that's because we got to see them having this disagreement and the frustration with the network saying, okay, you're done, just cut to a break. And they're like, we can't, we got an interview with this, we need to do this. And they're like, oh, all right, like you're going to break in 5. And he's like, okay, so we're going to a break now. So it was interesting how they just seamlessly interwove that. I thought that was great.
An interesting scene as well. Because apparently, I think there was 11 Israelis in the room to begin with. They kill 2 of them.
Yeah, I think
they kill 2 when they get in there. One of them escapes.
Yeah.
And he's obviously taken up by a couple of the news stations, ABC being one of them. And this was the interesting part about this whole like bureaucracy that was kind of dictating what they could and couldn't do, was that they got an interview slot with this Israeli that had escaped. And you'd think that this would be like front page, right? That this is the thing we need to be doing is who's in there? What happened? Is everybody like, can you tell us who's passed away? Like, that kind of thing. So they're live interviewing this guy and they're like, all right, you're getting to that time slot that the other company has. So you're going to have, you got to be done. And so like, what? It's just, the world is looking at us right now. You want to just switch over now? It's like, yeah. The time is the time. But it was interesting because that was, you saw that in 1972 or whatever, and you just see, hey, we're going to a break where we're going to switch over or whatever. But you don't understand why necessarily. It was an interesting window in the back to see why that happened. And then they seamlessly put that in with the actual footage of the Israeli and the anchorman talking and what he says on screen. And then they showed some interesting things too of like the old technology where there's a lady there dedicated strictly to the overlays. I'm not quite sure technically how they do this, but it was cool to see it. She had a board with a camera, and you could put whatever you wanted on this board. So like terrorist attack, 1972 Olympic Games, looking at the apartment, whatever. She would, set that all up on the board and then point the camera, and then that would overlay over the footage that they were shooting at the apartment. But when they switched over, they wanted to make sure that the world knew that this was still ABC's interview. And so she took the ABC logo and plastered it over the interview that was happening now in the different time slot. And it was very interesting. Like I said, a lot of the logistical things that they were tackling, but they showed a
Yeah.
lot of the old technology through that as well, like the old cameras that they were running around with,
Mm-hmm.
how they would overlay things, how they would preview before they slotted it into the live portion of the show, how they would continuously monitor the audio. It was super interesting. A lot of that stuff too. Like it was very detailed. You could tell that the guy paid special attention to making sure that all of it looked really authentic, but it felt how those guys would have felt. I mean, it's a lot of work that they were going through.
Yeah.
The amount of people that it took to get what you were seeing on the screen, it was a lot. There's
Yeah.
a lot of very dedicated individuals in there.
Yeah. Yeah. That stuff was really cool to see as well. I also liked this one moment in the film where I think they're on a break or something because it's running ads, and some of the people in the newsroom are watching like the Olympics or it's like some basketball game or whatever,
Yeah.
and the guy, the director or whatever, is like, "Hey guys, like knock it off," because they're like, "Oh," they get all excited and they're like, when there's someone scores or whatever, and he's like, "Hey, just knock it off," and then just kind of like dismisses that. And it almost synergizes in a separate moment where they're on break again and he's like just watching a game himself, but you can just see it in his face how much he just doesn't care. It's like he's not paying attention whatsoever. His mind is clearly just like on this actual event that's going on. And it reminded me a little bit in 12 Angry Men, which is of course a classic film that we're gonna have to talk about at some point. But in that movie, it's 12 jurors and they're deciding, the life or death of this like teenage boy, basically. And so they're debating about whether or not he actually did it or if it was proved beyond shadow of doubt. And there's a scene where some of the characters get distracted and they're doing like tic tac toe. And one of the characters goes up and grabs the paper and just like crumples up and says, "This isn't a game." And it reminded me of this similar kind of thing. It's like there is something serious going on in the room now. We are all gonna put aside yeah, we like games, we like these other our other interests, but those have to be rested for now because something more important is going on in our world, and we need to just give that a moment and give the families and the situation it's our due diligence until it resolves completely. So I liked that moment. It felt like a kind of a nice touch to just, again, like it's so short. It's barely, a mentionable thing, but like all these little moments are just like the point at which the script goes back and says, "Hey, there's an important like moral responsibility that actually pervades this entire thing." And I'm just going to show you those specific places of when that becomes important, and then the rest is yours.
Yeah. It's also a bit of a commentary on the film itself because the Olympic Games are supposed to service for that also because there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the previous tensions, but they're not ongoing problems. This is now just trying to like create a moment in time where they move forward from. But then obviously you have this event, and it's an interesting commentary on kind of just the escapism that people will engage in
Hmm.
because there's only so much you can do in that moment that at some point you've got to take a break, right? You can't just live in that stress.
Right.
You've got to blow off some steam. And so to have that kind of release, I think is important. Whereas I agree that, you should be taking this seriously. But at a certain point, you have to come to grips with the fact that, like, there's nothing I can do at the moment. I've been doing more than the average person anyway at this point. So, like,
Yeah.
it's good for me to have some kind of escape for a minute before I come back to the harsh realities of, this moment.
Yeah, and maybe that is like their way of coping with the situation.
Exactly.
So it almost isn't even to criticize them necessarily. It was just kind of like, and another way you could look at it is maybe because he's the director, he can't afford to do that,
There is
right?
that. Yeah,
So
their escapism can become a distraction. That's another interesting thing that I think it was commentating on the film too is, make sure that your escapism doesn't bleed into distracting other people and what their responsibilities are at the moment. Because like
mm,
he had more responsibilities than they did. They were just some
yeah,
guys turning some knobs in the background. He has to watch over however many people are in that room to make sure that what he's broadcasting to the world doesn't create a worse problem, which is
hmm,
something that they address later as well. Which
yeah,
actually we could probably get into if you don't have anything else to say there.
yeah. No, go for it.
Okay, so there's a moment in the film that kind of coalesces all the questions that they've been presenting to you. And it's very, I don't know, it was such a tangible way of doing it. I thought it was fascinating because obviously the world got the Anchorman's point, which you get the information on that side.
Mhm.
But this film presents how that decision was made in the first place. So apparently, these terrorists, they ask for a bus to get to an airport, and they're going to fly away. So he sends a team after them to go to the airport to kind of monitor what's going on, but they're not allowed in. They see some gunshots. They hear the battle raging essentially, and then a report comes out, and the report is that they killed all the terrorists and the Israelis all made it out, and the 9 that are left.
Mhm.
And so they call it in, but they're like, this is not confirmed. This is just something that's been going around. It's essentially a rumor.
Yeah.
And it gets to the newsroom. And so the director, he's given a choice. And the guy that allowed him to take that position for the day, he says, do not broadcast this. He's like, this is a dumb idea. It hasn't been confirmed. If you're wrong, this will come and bite you in the butt.
Right.
So he's faced with this decision. And then the director of the ABC station, he comes up and he says, release it. He's like, we need to release this information. And so he's stuck between these two.
And this is spoilers for the movie, if you couldn't tell.
But if you're familiar with the event, you already know what happens.
Yeah.
But he makes a call. He says, oh, you know what? I'm going to call it. So he says, hey, everybody survived. They took out the terrorists. We're good to go.
We use the phrase "as far as we know,"
as far
or
as we
something
know.
like that.
Yeah. He tries to cover his butt.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And within that, they hear a subsequent report from like a radio station or something that confirms the information. So then they're like, thank God, the risk paid off. They're actually free. This is great. We were the first ones that got this story out there.
It's a win-win.
And that was the point, is that they put aside what was right and said, nope, we could be the first ones to have broken the story and made history, essentially. And then it comes out that actually no one survived. All the hostages were killed, so were the terrorists. It was a massacre. It was total destruction. So now you have to deal with the fact that these families who have been probably watching and wringing their hands, this channel got this false hope for however long that was.
Yeah.
And then found out that not only were they wrong, but they were reported to without having any kind of substantiation. So like these guys had this information that it was a big responsibility. They should have taken that with a lot more gravitas, and they didn't. And the consequences that came with that were pretty severe. They resolved that pretty interestingly. I guess we can leave that one out probably because it's not like huge spoilers or whatever. But the way that they deal with that is pretty interesting with the character. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting way of kind of just neatly tying that bow of all the moral questions that they'd been asking throughout the whole movie. Of
you could see their faults a little bit in there.
Not only the faults, but it's also like, here's what happens when you're not careful, when you don't pay attention, or when you don't ask those questions and have an answer before you act. And that, like I said, the consequences are pretty dire. I mean, can you imagine being the one who made that call and was like, yeah, they're all alive, and then finding out that you were that wrong because you didn't substantiate it? Like, at some point, you might have to look one of those families in the face and be like, I trusted you. You were the one that was showing integrity through this whole time, and then the one time that you didn't, I had to suffer for that.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine. Like, I would have a lot of sleepless nights after that.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to see the humanization of the guys behind it, because I understand why he made the call. And the movie does a really great job of making sure you understand that. But at the same time, like, I remember I was sitting in the chair and I was like, I don't know how I'd feel if I were in his position for sure, but I was silently to myself like, don't report that, man. Don't.
I wasn't
do
silent.
It.
I heard you.
I was like, don't do it.
Like, don't do it, man.
And he did it, and I was like, oh man, I hope this pays off for you, because that would be rough.
That goes into like just how tense this movie is too. I think it's easy to get really sucked in and like, man, there's a lot going on here. This is tight.
Yeah, and they did a great job.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No.
Well, I was gonna say we can move over to Munich unless you had further comments. So if you have further comments,
No,
good.
that I was about to do the same thing. I
Okay.
think now this is a good opportunity to switch over to Munich. So yeah, but September 5th, great film.
Yeah.
Totally worth seeing and an absolute Oscar snub. Actually, if you like films like 12 Angry Men or like Network, I would say this is a great movie that kind of it's not I don't know that I would rate it in the same way because Network has like a different focus, but it is that similar kind of movie where it's all about like journalists hanging out, doing stuff. And those I like those
Journalism and
movies.
stuff.
Yeah, journalism movies are fun
Mhm.
usually when they're not of a certain crappy caliber, which shall not be named.
That's fair. I think this one did a really good job of making sure that you understood.
Yeah.
Yeah, how they were coming about it. All right. So Munich.
So Munich. So with that in mind, I think you can watch September 5th and then watch Munich immediately after, which is what we did. And it's like a two-parter. Munich follows it
It
up
is.
like it literally feels like a sequel, even though it came out,
20 years earlier.
20 years later. It doesn't look dated at all, though.
Oh no.
It's aged super, super well. This is a phenomenal movie.
Yeah. And I didn't know it existed for one. For two, I didn't know it was a Spielberg film. Because yeah, we left the theater and you're like, yeah, we should watch the other one that's on this topic. And I was like, what? And you're like, yeah, it's a Spielberg movie. And I was like, double what? So yeah, we ended up watching this a couple days afterwards, and it is not the same event. It surrounds the same event, but this one tackles what happens after the events of
Yeah.
September 5th.
The fallout of what this event spurred into motion.
And it also tackles it in a very objective way, which is surprising. I know Spielberg is a master at his craft, but he's obviously Jewish. He probably has some pretty strong feelings on this whole matter. His grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. He had the
Oh, wow.
tattoo and everything.
Goodness.
So, like I said, it's very, very interesting to see how he would portray these series of events.
Mm-hmm.
Again, expert job. The movie's fantastic. Specifically, and I can't express this enough, the cinematography was just, and I
That
don't,
was incredible.
regardless of whether this man has done cinematography for him before, like this movie stood out.
Yeah.
For a couple different
Wow.
reasons. I think one of the things that really stood out to me was that he really emulated this 70s style of shooting, specifically in these like kind of weird dramatic zoom ins and zoom outs.
Yeah.
But it's great. He
Yeah.
uses it so wonderfully, because like that's classic filmmaking. Like if you watch most films or certain films from the 70s, it's
Yeah.
very like they'll go right up in this person's face, or they'll be like on a rooftop or something.
Yeah.
But
But it's an espionage film, so it totally fit
This is
with
fair.
the kind of
Right. The
cat
style.
and mouse stuff that's going on.
Yep. Yeah. So the events of it does kind of cover the September 5th events.
Yeah, that's like the prelude to the film.
Right.
And it's considered an epic, and I would agree with that. It's super long. It's got a
Yeah.
lot going on in it. But yeah, it's just if I was to ever teach a class on like filmmaking, specifically directing the camera,
Oh yeah.
this film would be at the top of that list. Like, oh my gosh, the number of scenes where I would just stop and go like, whoa, like that took some serious work to make that shot work. Like you're following a character, then he gets in a car, and then he's in the rear view mirror. And I'm like, how did you get him exactly so that I'm looking at him in perfect focus in the rear view mirror? Or like there's one that just like blew my mind where it's like a car pulls up to a character, they have this exchange, and then the car pulls away. The camera moves into a building as a character runs. The car stops just so we can see it through the frame of a window, and then the character walks into that frame as well and gets into the car. It was like, geez, everybody hit their mark exactly. How many times did you have to do that until it was perfect? So there was, and it was just constantly the whole movie. It just the camera work was just like you're over here, you're looking at this, now you're looking at that, now you're looking at that, and
But it wasn't overwhelming. Like it's not
No.
overstimulating. He's extremely thoughtful as to what you're seeing in what moment, and making sure that he's directing your attention expertly.
Yes.
And at no point does it feel like you see anything that you shouldn't or you don't need to. Everything is just, it was great. It was,
Yeah.
it's such a treat. It was one of the few weeks that we watched 2 movies back to back that were just great. I was like, oh, thank God.
We needed a break.
After all this garbage we've been trudging through. Yeah, this movie, like you said, aged incredibly well. I would not have known that it was 20 years old. And it's not
Yeah.
that, movies from that time look bad or anything. I mean, there's a certain style to the early 2000s, though, that did not bleed through in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's a testament to Spielberg or, cinematographer, whatever. It felt very timeless.
Mm-hmm.
I would even argue that this kind of falls in line with The Brutalist, where it felt like a time capsule film.
Yeah.
Like it reflects its time or the time that it's representing, but also, feels very accessible to a modern audience.
Mhm.
But this movie focuses on a team.
Well, yeah, that's the big difference from The Brutalist. Is this movie has a focus.
This-
So it's a little different.
God. I will watch this one again. So this movie depicts what the response from the Israelis is to the terrorist attack.
Yeah.
So they basically send in an espionage team to start taking out leaders of this Palestinian movement,
Mhm.
and then the moral qualms that come with that. So it focuses on the main character, Eric Bana. That's the actor. I don't remember the character's name, but he's kind of the lead of this team, and it's really interesting. The rest of the film, I'd recommend you just go watch it. But the thesis is the moral conundrums that he finds himself in, but also kind of how it degrades his soul.
Yeah, moral
Like, eats at him.
decay seemed
Yeah.
like a really important theme for this one because some people, I kind of want to address the controversy a little bit because there's a slight one with this movie. Some people don't like some of the inaccuracies. Like for one, apparently they did not put the pressure on like one team to assassinate all of these people. They would just do like one team to assassinate one guy, and then that team would disband, and then they would make a new team and do another guy. But
You
like
can
that
tell-
doesn't work for a movie because
Right.
we need to follow the character because we need to know like what's the kind of broader picture that
Yeah.
you're saying with this, right?
He's dealing with a specific theme, and that's that moral decay.
Yeah.
And that only works following a specific character that you can kind of understand.
Mm-hmm.
And that he does that expertly. And I think that he took creative license for sure, but also it even addresses at the end of the movie, like, it's inspired by true events.
Yes,
You're not really
it does say
sure the
that.
whole story. It seems like it's probably wrapped in a lot of red tape, probably a lot of black ink that you
Mm-hmm.
probably just don't know the whole thing. You do know that they took action, and you knew that they probably, it's like that movie Green Zone that deals with the weapons of mass destruction. It's like, we don't know a whole lot, but we do know that it was causing these effects. And you got to ask the question, like, whether the effects were worth the actions you took. And that's what this
Mhm.
movie addresses, is like, was this response not only proportionate, but was it necessary? And at what cost?
Yeah.
And that's portrayed through the main character. And like you said, at the end, becomes real paranoid, almost to the point of like schizophrenia. Like he's just,
Mhm.
he's not able to live his life anymore.
Yeah.
Despite all that he has, his wife and his kid, and being able to live in the society that's safe compared to what the life that he's been living for the past however long that time period went.
As a bona fide assassin.
Exactly.
Yeah. He's going through his whole life, and the characters that you're following, they'll just say horrible things about Palestinians and Arabs, and they're just like, oh yeah, those people are horrible, and I just want to see them all dead. And I mean, it's like literally like those are some of the lines that they will say in this movie. So they have no sympathy for these people whatsoever. And they will talk with each other about their personal lives and be like, oh, like,
How's your daughter?
yeah, how's your daughter? And
I
like
just killed a couple today.
yeah, like the same. It was like, wait a minute, we were just talking about something else. You don't see like the kind of depravity that this is. And the beauty of the movie is that it lets that play out for a good long while and doesn't really touch it too much until we start nearing the end, like the last like
Right.
30 minutes. Then it starts to show where characters are having doubt or questioning it or seeing some real damages take place. And that's where the movie succeeds for me. If not for that ending where it just starts to be like, hey, don't think that you're going to get off the hook because of some of the stuff you did
Right.
earlier.
Whatever justifications you're using doesn't mean that these actions won't have consequences.
Or precisely, yeah. Like one of the characters, so like I don't want to. I think I could talk about this one without being too specific. But they assassinate this one person who was not necessarily an enemy of theirs in the same way. They weren't exactly associated with the terrorist attack, and they weren't asked to take them out, basically. But this person did target them and take out one of their guys. So they went for like a revenge sort of ploy. So they go out, they finish her off, and then like the way that they leave her body is just really like disrespectful.
Yeah.
And
well, they let their personal animus get in the way of basically just a job. She was just doing a job. They're just taking her out to like remove somebody who's
that
a
obstacle
threat,
from.
essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
But one of the guys, like, it's not well, I guess it is kind of desecration. He allows his personal like they took care of it. She's dead. She's gone. But
Right.
he has to add insult to injury on
Yeah.
top of it, and then it starts to affect him later.
And then he's like, "Why did I do that?"
He's like, in the moment, I did this thing, and now I'm dealing with the consequences of that. Because I mean, your conscience will eat at you. Like,
yeah.
was that necessary? At what cost did you do that?
And that was interesting too, because when he says that, the other guys respond and were like, "Well, you weren't yourself."
Right.
And this is their justification for it.
Right.
But it like completely does, it just like bounces off of him.
Mhm.
And like I feel like it would have landed like earlier in the movie, but at that point it was just like boing, not gonna do it. He's like, no, my conscience is genuinely bothered by that.
Yeah.
And it was like, woof,
And
this is getting scary.
To Spielberg's credit, that moment, because he lets the whole thing play out. And I know it wasn't like a huge audience; it was just us watching it. But I can imagine whenever anyone watches that scene, it's really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, what do you need to do? Like, despite the fact that you agree with him that this person needs to go, just that whole scene is just like, oh, we've taken this way too far, man. Why are you doing this?
Yeah, the vindictive
like, ugh.
nature of
Right. And where that takes him.
Yeah, it's kind of like, but then I also feel like it starts to backpedal like even more so, because then it's like, wait a minute, what led you to this in the first place? It's like, you're gonna kill this person when they were just doing a job. Like, I get that they targeted you, but like, you weren't commissioned to kill them. And then it also is like, should you be killing people anyways? And if you want to take like a global picture, because you're looking at that consequence on one hand, and then you have other consequences, like with Eric Bana's character, who starts to just like
Totally
the
lose it.
paranoia completely consumes him. Like it's spooky. So it starts to be like some of the other films like that'll depict paranoia really well. Like The Player does a pretty good job of that. There's a number of others, but yeah, where it's just like everything he sees is like, and he's like checking things because they like rig bombs, like in like beds and phones, and he's like dismantling them in his house to find. It's like, oh well, I did this, so now it's like it's on my conscience. So did someone else doing it to me now? Because now I'm a target. I'm the one being hunted.
Thing was that he was exploiting his own methods. The things that he had done to other people is what he was most afraid of. He's like, because they rigged someone's bed, so every time he gets into a bed, now he's got to check under the mattress.
Yeah.
Even though that's never happened to him, he's never been under that threat. He knows what he's done.
Yeah.
And so he knows how that person can think.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not, he doesn't go outside of his own imagination, which is interesting because now you can tell like that's a sign of moral decay. Like that's self-destruction at its finest, is that he's now looking at his own actions and applying them externally, like as if he's someone else attacking him or potentially attacking him. And so he's just fighting with himself.
Yeah.
But he's scared of what he could do. It was an interesting depiction at the end because you can tell like...
Or being scared of himself.
Right. That too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, at that point, it leads to those questions of like, can you be redeemed after that? Like, is there a way back to humanity after you've crossed these lines? And some of the characters say no.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. I think also, too, one of the other complaints people had with this movie that I was reading about was, so there's a scene where they actually commissioned a larger group to help them take out a couple people. Yeah. And it
like
turns
a whole army.
It was like an army, yeah. And they do this massive shootout. They're just gunning people down. And you're like, whoa, I thought we were trying to do the espionage thing. I thought we were just trying to target, the heads of this. And all these other people are just in the crossfire. And some people didn't like that because they felt like it was like, how are they not like addressing that? But I was like, the movie is addressing it.
Yeah.
The whole point of the movie is like they've decided that we're going to demonize and dehumanize these people so much that they're just in the way. Like we're just going to gun them down. Like, I mean, if we don't, they're just going to replace the person that we're trying to target. So they all need to be wiped out. That is like the logic of their thinking. And there's an interesting conversation that complements it between Eric Bana and it's like one of the Arab spies. They're Arab, right? Or they
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some kind of distinction. We'll just call them Palestinian.
Palestinian.
Though.
Okay, I'm not entirely positive, so
Yeah,
forgive
our
my
geopolitics are a little rusty.
yeah rough. Regardless, he's on the opposing side, and they kind of run into each other, and they have to play up like or Eric Bana and his team have to play up like they're Germans, and they're just at best Jewish sympathizers, and that's that. And they have this dialogue exchange, and they both explain their points, and the resentment between them exists, and then they move on, and then like shootouts ensue and everything. And it was kind of like you saw them, it's like they had a chance to try to mend their situation between each other, but it was clear like it's just so embedded. There's no hope for that. Like they have no interest in doing that whatsoever. So it was almost like all Spielberg did was show that, like, look, people on both sides of this issue, they don't want it resolved. They don't want it resolved unless the other party is just completely eradicated entirely. That's what they want. And he just says, if you want that, here's the consequences you will pay if you do that.
Sure.
And that's it. That's the end. And I thought I was like, what else do you need? I feel like that's super, that's a really good position to take. He's just being honest about what the damages will be to your own humanity. Can't argue with that.
Sure. Yeah, and the movie portrayed that expertly.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, that thesis bleeds through really well. And you ask the same questions he's asking. Is like, man, as much as you may agree or disagree, like, is this really the route that you should take to get to that conclusion? I mean, to go back further than that, will it lead to that conclusion? I mean, what is at the end of this road?
Yeah,
will
exactly.
you get what you're asking for, or is this going to be completely different than what you wanted? And again, at what cost?
Mm-hmm.
And this movie showed like this is a very, very real potential cost that could come from this, and it's not pretty.
And it should be there. It's like
Right.
there should be moral like consequences for these kinds of acts.
Yeah.
So I was glad that he, unearthed that. And then, yeah, this is just a really solid movie. I mean, it even has a straight up Godfather sequence in it where they go and they talk to like a Don. He's like French though, I think.
Yes.
And he's their supplier, and they're just like information brokers basically. And they, you get to see him with like his huge family, and they have this nice dinner. And
the one that he cooks.
Yeah, he cooks it himself.
Like cooking it.
Yeah, and then like, afterwards,
You're like a son to me.
yeah, you're like a son to me. Yeah, he says all that kind of stuff. And then he says something, he's like, well, you pay well and you pay on time, so we'll continue to supply you. But this mistake you made, that's never going to happen again. And it was like, these guys are scary.
Yep.
Yeah, so that was interesting and apparently that whole thing is made up. That's not actually, they didn't have like that broker.
Like I said, a lot of creative license in the movie.
But it was kind of like they were just using them as like a neutral party, right? It's like there are some people who are not going to take sides on this particular issue, and this is how they see the logic of navigating espionage. And yeah, I don't know. So
it's also an interesting way of kind of providing a better window in for an audience. Because an audience that may not have a prejudice on either side, being able to have a neutral party in order to understand this a little bit more effectively, or even to see how other people are getting some kind of gain from it, which is what they were doing, is interesting. But it also opens up the conversation of creative license. Because art, and this will be a conversation especially over February and March within the Oscars, is how much is okay or not okay to do. Because on one hand, Spielberg's telling a story that really happened.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, there's only so much of that story he can tell.
Yeah.
For multiple reasons. So he's got to kind of fill in the blanks in order to properly convey to an audience what his message is or what the message of that time was in order to give you a window into the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I think despite all the like inaccuracies of the film, it is interesting how he uses those things in order to strengthen the message of the movie, the thesis of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was a really good example because, like I said, even at the end, inspired by true events is typically, it's a good indicator that okay, this is definitely not a play-by-play, but there's enough truth in here to kind of understand. It gives you better context to the events that surround it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, as you continue on with like the Dawn not being real or different teams being employed to do these things for each leader rather than it being one team kind of going through the whole thing, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't.
What matters is that we kind of understand better why all
Yeah.
this stuff was going on. And I think both films actually handle that really well. Is that it, the first film, September 5th, also didn't have a message, but it really wanted to make sure you understood what was going on at the time. Maybe not so much why, but definitely like this is what was going on at the time, and kind of how people were viewing it, and what caused these things, what led to them, and then kind of where it went afterwards, rather than giving you some kind of propaganda piece.
Yeah.
And sometimes you got to take some creative liberties and licenses with that. And I
Yeah,
think
there's
they
an
both did.
emotional meaning
Right.
that needs to be maintained, and that's important too.
Right.
And I feel like it's just really dismissive. I mean, the only reason why I brought up the controversies with Munich at all is that's the only negative things I could find about this movie.
That's fair.
And I don't even agree with them. In fact, I have like we usually when we write our scripts, we have a what did we like and what did we not like. But when we got to what did we not like, it's like there's nothing to say for either film.
Right.
These are great films, and like Munich, now that has the benefit of hindsight and time, I'm like, this is a masterpiece.
Well, it's
like,
also contextualized with September 5th, which was also interesting.
right.
Because now you have more information or kind of a more on the ground view at the event that pushed Munich into being.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'd recommend watching it in that just because that's how we did it. But still, either one will contextualize the other to give more information. But you're right. I mean, there really isn't anything negative to say about either one. I mean, you might find one or two nitpicks, I guess, based on your preferences. But
yeah, I mean, if you're someone who wants like more, like if you're expecting like Tarantino levels of character portrayal, like you're not
Sure.
going to get that in either movie. That's not really what they're about. The event and like the story is more important. So as long as you accept that, then you're fine. But there's plenty of movies that do really well by focusing on story and less on character. Usually your plot has to favor one or the other anyways. It's very hard to do both equally well. But yeah, I just want to say, like, I honestly feel like Munich is like top 5, if not top 3 best Spielberg pictures. I'd be willing to go that far with it. It's that good. I was really, really enraptured with this movie. It's right up there with Fabelmans for me. I'm like, dude, knocking it out of the park here. So
he deserves the respect that he gets for sure.
Absolutely.
This is one of those moments that proves it.
Yeah. Yeah, it was just like, just thinking about like I can kind of get people's like lukewarm reaction to it if like, because it is long and it has a very subdued like gray color palette.
It does.
So it's kind of like, it's kind of cold feeling a little bit, but I felt like
thematic.
Yeah, it perfectly fit. It's like they're hitmen. They're killing these people. And when they start, this is actually another good one. That's probably worth mentioning. They're gonna do this assassination on this one guy, and his daughter and his wife leave. But the thing is they come back because she forgot something, and they didn't notice that. And so the daughter goes up.
Oh, yeah. That was such an intense moment.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah. And like the guy, he's supposed to call and verify that it's the right person he's going to blow up with a bomb. And when he does, he hears the little girl's voice. And he's like, okay, I know she left, but what's happening? So he hangs up and then bolts to the guy with the bomb and is like, abort the crap out of this. Just abort, abort, abort. And they like, it's like this super tense moment. But that was like an early example when they're starting off their assassinations, and then they clearly have a moral compass.
Yeah.
Right?
And it gets muddled as the movie continues.
And it gets muddled and degraded, like with that woman later on. And it's like, whoa, like what happened? Where did you lose that along the way? And it's like that slippery slope idea, right? Or the snowball effect. So, yeah, just really powerful movies. It was nice to watch good movies.
Yeah, and I think it was easier to, well, not easier. It was There was a lot to appreciate because they were handling actual historical events that are extremely politically charged.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the context of today, obviously, there's a lot of conflict going on with the Israelis and Palestine. So to release this, I understand like you're gonna get some more eyes on it, but to do it without necessarily taking a stance or stepping on too many toes. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that necessarily, but I think it's interesting to show an objective viewpoint and being like, hey man, maybe it's better that we talk rather than just
Yeah.
shooting each other up all the time. But yeah, I mean, considering the historical context, I think they both masterfully handled the subject matter really well.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, great movies. It was just nice to go and enjoy a great movie.
It was a good reminder too. You said this actually before we started recording, that like sometimes if it's just a good movie and you just focus on that, you kind of really can trust everyone to take the rest. Because I think normally when I hear people make the comment like, oh, people just want fun, they just want escapism, I tend to like dismiss it because I'm like, well, I want like something valuable out of my movie going experience. But I think I didn't quite realize that if the movie is focused on just execute the story fairly, honestly, and with a level of tact and craftsmanship that's deserving of merit, then it's kind of like your message will then be present and we can kind of take the reins from there, assuming you chose a good subject matter. And in the case of these two movies, they obviously did.
Right.
It's very timely, both when they came out and
now.
And now. So I feel like, but it was a nice win for like, maybe there is something really important about like just focus on making a good movie and stop focusing on like what you think the important thing is from the movie and trying to push that, because that gets sussed out very quickly. And that's when people are going to start accusing you of, propaganda or like force feeding. And nobody likes that. Nobody likes that stuff. And
very off-putting.
It is off-putting, yeah, and I think it really damages the art form. I don't think I don't think it lasts is the problem. Whereas, like, we can revisit Munich and go like, wow, that really carries some weight to it.
Right.
And even if let's say you don't know anything about the situation, let's say you don't care at all, you might now after seeing the movie. And even if you didn't, it's still a masterful execution of just a story about that moral decay subject. So it's kind of like it has everything right going for it. It happens to be about something real, which makes it more personal, more tangible. But even if it didn't have that, it would still be a powerful story,
Yeah, that's fair.
And so,
and it might encourage people. It might be the open door into which people jump into the subject material and research further on their own. At which point you can develop your own opinion.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting to remove any personal animus and say, hey, maybe it's something you should look at before you take a stance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both movies do that expertly.
Yeah.
No, any closing thoughts? I mean, you kind of just went through your whole monologues.
They were both snubbed.
Yeah, unfortunately.
They were both snubbed too much.
Hardcore.
Like, even though Munich was nominated for a bunch of stuff, the cinematography snub. And also, I'd like to see some wins.
Yeah, that's right.
What for 24?
I forgot it was. I thought it was a 25 movie, but it is 2024.
September 5th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is snubbed from this Oscar season.
Yep.
Ridiculous.
Absolutely ridiculous.
Great movie. Way better
Great
than
films.
some of the other ones on that list, which we're probably gonna go watch in the moment. So pray for us.
But let's just enjoy this moment.
This is
good
a good moment.
movies.
This is a good moment.
Feels good.
It does. Thank you for joining.